Okay, so today we're going to visit one of the most profound statements that was ever uttered by one of the masters of self. Back 2,600 years ago, a man by the name of Lao Tzu. Laozi is how you spell his name. Sometimes we spell it Lao space Tzu and pronounce it Lao Tzu in the West. Lao Tzu means old man or wise man in Chinese. And basically, that's what he was. He wrote the Tao Te Ching. Go. Hey, welcome to the Iron Podcast, where we answer all the questions about spirituality and inner peace you ever wanted to ask. I'm your host, Sean Webb. Okay, so today, first, a little house cleaning. Thank you to all the new subscribers from Africa, from Norway, from Scotland, from India, from all over the United States. I hope I'm not missing anyone. Thank you, and thank you for the financial contributions that some of you have made to help support this podcast. We really appreciate that. You can find those links at iamspirituality.com. Today, we're going to talk about one of the better sayings from a man called Lao Tzu. Laozi is how you spell his name. Sometimes we spell it Lao space Tzu here in the West and call him Lao Tzu, which is inaccurate. Lao Tzu translates into old man, sometimes loosely translated into wise old man. But basically the story of Lao Tzu was one of interest. My favorite version of the story is that he was an old man who gave talks in his village, in his area, and people came from miles around to listen to him. And then when one of the dynasties in his time was starting to transition, he saw the writing on the wall and decided to go live off in the forest by himself, started to pack his things, and one of the guards who had listened to him on a regular basis saw him at the gate leaving with all his stuff and said, "Hey, you got to write some of this down." And Lao Tzu kind of chuckled, laughed, whatever, said, no, I'll just be leaving. And the guard really didn't take no for an answer and threw Lao Tzu in jail, handed him some paper and a pen and said, "Write down this wisdom for the world before you leave, or you won't get out of jail." And so Lao Tzu thought better about his original decision and wrote the Tao Te Ching in 3 days, threw the papers at the guard on the way out, and left forever. And 2,600 years later, we still have one of the most popular books of wisdom in the world, translated into tons of languages, called the Tao Te Ching. Well, one of the coolest statements attributed to Lao Tzu is one where he said this: "To know that you do not know is best. To pretend to know when you do not is a disease." And I love this statement for multiple reasons. I think it's so beautiful and so elegant, and its juxtaposition of the first half with the second half. Let's get into it. Because with the first portion of this statement, Lao Tzu, first of all, is talking about the secrets of self, right? And so the secrets of self are multiple leveled secrets, but basically one of the original secrets of self is that the thing that we identify with in our mind sense of self, our ego, sometimes called, is not really us. And it's kind of a bullshit illusion that causes all of our pain and suffering. And I'm explaining that exact process with scientific detail in this book that we're about to throw out. And so, the first portion of the statement that he's talking about, the self, what he's saying is, to know that you do not know is yourself is the best. To know that you do not know the truth about yourself is the best. And this is kind of just a common sense statement to say, to know that you don't know yourself and so you can look for it is the best. Because really, what human in their right mind would go out looking for something which they already possessed or thought they already possessed? Like, I'm not going to walk around my neighborhood looking for where I parked my car if I truly believe that it's parked in my garage. So to know that I don't know where my car is the best, so that I can walk around and look for it and find my car. If I think it's in the garage and it's not in the garage, then that's bad for me, because when I go to find it, then I'm not going to have a car. I'm not going to know where to go. I'm going to be late for wherever I'm going because it's parked somewhere around the neighborhood, and I didn't look for it even though because I thought I knew where it was, right? So what he's telling us in that first part of the statement is just really black and white, really simple. To know that you don't know about yourself is the best. Because if you think you know yourself, if you think you have this thing, if you believe that your ego is yourself, if you believe that your sense of self is your true self, then you won't ever go searching deeper within you for the truth of existence that exists just beyond that fake false self of our mind's understanding of self, right? Because the truth is, and we can go back into the episodes earlier in this podcast, you aren't your religion, you aren't your nationality, you are not your gender, you are not your sexual preference, you are not your political preference, you are not all of these things that you point to when you say, who am I, right? Your brain comes up with these things, but these are simply ideas of self that your brain tries to cling to. And the brain is required to have a sense of self, right? So there's the issue there, is that, we don't have a sense of self. We don't have something that we can point to our sense of self until we start throwing a bunch of these things into this self bucket. And that's what the brain does, because the brain is required to have a self, because the brain is this organ of survival, right? And so when it takes in all the senses and all the thoughts and things like that and analyzes them for threats, one question must first be asked: a threat to what? Right? Because that's all the brain is. The brain is a big old soup of electrochemicals and signals and neurotransmitters that basically help us survive from one day to the next, right? We figure out how to build a shelter. We remember where the water is. We learn that we can only be 100 feet from a bear, and if we get 99 feet from a bear, then that's probably going to kill us. That type of thing. Not really. Don't go 100 feet from a bear. But the brain is this organ of survival. And so in analyzing threats from the world, the question must be asked, okay, a threat to what? And that requires a self to be created, an understanding of ourself. A threat to what? What am I protecting, right? And so that's where the sense of self comes in. And so Lao Tzu is saying, well, this thing that we have in our mind that we consider ourselves really isn't ourselves, and that's the truth of spirituality and spiritual existence. I mean, that's what Jesus was talking about when he was talking about of those of you who do not know yourselves, you live in poverty and you are the poverty. And when Lao Tzu, when the Prophet Muhammad said, he who knows himself knows God, these types of statements are exactly what we're talking about, in that there's a deeper reality of self within us that can be discovered once you pass the fact that you're not, all these things that you cling to. You're not your body, you're not your politics, your religion, your nationality, your race, your whatever. You're not these things. And there is a reality that comes into focus once you calm that stuff down. So in his first part of his statement, that's basically what Lao Tzu is saying. He's saying, to know that you don't know is the best, because then you can look for it. But then in the second part of the statement, it gets really awesome, because then he says, to pretend to know when you do not know is a disease. And this part of the statement has 4 awesome truths in it that are so complex, they juxtapose the original, innocent, simple statement of the first portion, and they really deliver a huge amount of wisdom and truth in the one additional sentence. Because what Lao Tzu is talking about is to pretend to know when we do not, right? And that's being fooled. It's not pretending to know something intentionally. He's not saying that, to lie about yourself is a disease. What he is saying is to be mistaken and accept that you know yourself, because you're clinging to your ego, you're clinging to your sense of self in your mind as yourself, right? And that's what causes all of our negative emotions and all of our negative thoughts and all of the stuff that I explain in the book and have explained earlier in the podcast episodes, right? To pretend to know, you're pretending to know by simply accepting that your sense of self is your true self, that your ego is your true self. So that's pretending to know. I pretend to know that I know who I am because I just simply accept the illusion of the mind that tells me what I am, or wants to suggest to me what I am, right? So to pretend to know when we do not is a disease. I love this word disease, because disease implies, one, the physiological genetic disease of being handed a brain that, without the wherewithal to understand the deeper self, because the brain is trying to, follow its charter of being this organ of survival. It needs to create a self, right? It needs to create, because again, when we're talking about taking the world's senses in and scanning them for risks and threats, well, a threat to what? And so the brain must immediately, from the moment that mommy says, mommy, and you, and points that finger at you, all of a sudden you start your sense of self. You become everything within the confines of your skin, because then she starts pointing at the doggy and saying doggy, and starts pointing at Aunt Patty and saying Aunt Patty, and starts pointing at daddy and saying daddy, right? These things have different names and they're not you. And so you must be the things within the confines of your skin. And then later on, we start to add things like, I'm a boy, I'm a girl, and all that means to society. And, we are this political party, or we are this religion, or we are this whatever that's handed you from your family. And so those become part of your sense of self. And then we start piling on all these things, right? Well, the brain has to do that. The brain is forced to do that because it has to have a definition of self to compare against the threats of the world. The threats of the world are coming in to threaten what? Okay, so we got to have that laundry list of self, right? So Lao Tzu uses the word disease to describe the genetic components and characteristics of our brain that forces us almost into accepting this egoic, false sense of self as our true self first, right? So he points it out that it's a disease there, but then also there's a double meaning to that word disease, because we also teach sense of self in mommy and you, right? When she does that, or daddy and you, or, the world and you, and you're separate from everything else. And you are the things that are within the confines of your skin, right? And the thoughts and the feelings and the emotions and all that's you. When the reality is it's not you. And we start to understand that when we start to do things that raise meta-awareness, like meditation and other disciplines. And this brand new thing that I'm putting out in this book is a whole nother separate course into meta-awareness. It creates the separation of our awareness and our mind, because the fact remains, you realize when you're able to see your mind and you realize the separateness between your awareness and your mind. So you're kind of standing there in your awareness, although it's nebulous, you're not standing anywhere. You're just there in your awareness, and you're seeing your mind in operation. And you do this through meditation, or you do this through our Body, Mind, Spirit 101, where we show you exactly how your emotions work and how your mind works, and so you can actually see it in action as it works. Well, that creates this space of separation between you and your mind. And so therefore, you start to see, wow, I am not completely my mind. My awareness is separate there in some shape or fashion, right? And so that gets us into this, okay, well, maybe I'm not my mind space. But what we teach ourselves as humans about self and about identity is that you are separate, and that you are everything within the confines of your skin, and that you are everything within the confines of your mind, and that's it. That's all it is. And so Lao Tzu uses the word disease to explain how we transmit from one person to another inadvertently. And what else is a disease than an illness that causes pain and suffering in our lives, inadvertently transmitted from one person to another? So I love that he uses this word disease, because when we do, I am mommy and you are you, and this is daddy and this is the doggy, and these are, and these are the things that define us in our mind, and this is our group, and this is our tribe, and this is the things we care about, and that becomes yourself. And so we propagate this whole sickness on ourselves. And so I think it's great. I think his use of the word disease there is just so poignant, because it points to so many truths, right? And to pretend to know when we don't, right? That is the accidental perpetuation. We're actors on a stage acting out a character that we completely believe is us, but that isn't us. And so we have a sickness in our heads. It's an illness of the mind. right? And so the great masters of the past who have gotten through this sickness and gotten over this sickness and discovered the reality of existence just beyond this self, this identification of mind, sense of self, this ego thing, right? The people who have gotten beyond that have been the world's greatest luminaries, and the ones that we look at as part of our search for self, our search for truth, our search for God. Because, when you're talking about Jesus talking about self and the secrets of self and knowing yourself, and you're talking about the Prophet Muhammad knowing yourself, and you have, Lao Tzu himself said, he who knows himself is enlightened. And, Buddhism is all about finding your Buddha nature underneath the false self of existence, the ego identity, right? All of the world's religions are really based on enlightenment and getting past the self and getting into that space that is connected. Now, here's the cool thing. We don't know where that connection comes from, right? A few things could happen. Our neurons are made up of the microtubules, right? Microtubules have been proven in a lab to interact with quantum mechanics. And so there is a direct line to beyond space and time in our brains, because quantum mechanics works both beyond space and beyond time. Quantum entanglement, you change one particle over infinite distances and immediately, instantly, it changes the other particle over infinite spaces. There have been a number of studies that have proven that time is not really a factor sometimes in being able to have future events predict past reactions in people. And they've done studies where there is a statistical high probability that future events can influence past actions, which is really weird. But there is a scientific reality that, it could come through the microtubules of our brain that transcend space and time. Or, heck, who knows? Our DNA is so complex, over 2 billion lines of code there, that, memories, which have been proven to be passed down from one cell to another. Like if you take a rat and you put it in a bad environment and you shock him, with a weird pattern on the walls or whatever, you take that rat out, you let him have babies. The baby you've never had exposed to the bad environment or any other weird environment of that sort, you put him in that bad environment where his dad got shocked, he freaks out. Or mom. I think they use females more than males. But they freak out because the memory has been passed down from generation to generation. And so who knows what we're tapping into when we get the mind to quiet and we get those thoughts and the default mode network to downregulate to the point that we can hear what's going on maybe in other spaces in our mind, or we tap into other things, or we get that dimethyltryptamine flush that's the extreme neurotransmitter agonist that gets everything firing all at once and everybody starts talking to everybody at the same time. Maybe that grants access to the information in the DNA that's held that goes back to the beginning of time. Because guess what? You, sitting there watching this video, your body has never tasted death. The cells in your body have existed in DNA form since the beginning of life, whenever it began. And so take into consideration that for just a second, that you're a miracle of fucking nature, that every one of your ancestors all along the way from, whether you want to believe God created the world 6,000 years ago and put everybody on it, which is statistically impossible. But let's say God did that and made all the evidence of all the earlier Earth as a test of our faith. It doesn't matter, because from Adam and Eve, or from when we climbed out of the ocean, every one of your ancestors up until this point has survived. Every one of them. They have survived potential meteor strikes. They've survived how many animals wanting to kill them, how many wars. I mean, we've killed more humans than anything in the history of time, I think. And so you made it. How awesome is that? But how unbelievably fucking amazing is it that you can actually trace back through your DNA to the very moment that life began? How friggin' awesome is that? You're a part of that chain. And so you may have some of the memories up here, right? Carl Jung, because I'm reading this book, I'm reminded of all of these awesome notes that I've taken. Carl Jung was one of the best psychologists in history and basically rewrote psychology for the world. He was an enlightened guy and got a lot of his information from his awakening and his tapping into the wisdom and the knowledge that exists within the cells or within the connection to beyond space and time self or consciousness that exists, that we access through our microtubules, whatever. You can read it, you can see it in his writings and in his talks, and he's in especially something that is very common to a mystical or enlightenment experience is that a lot of times you get to see the universe in all the stars, and that's exactly what Jung said one day, is that when you dive into self, you get to see the universe and all the stars in infinity, which is true. I mean, it's a very common report of many mystical experiences, many awakening experiences, that's part of the thing that you get to see, is that you get introduced to the universe and the intelligence in the universe, in every space in between the spaces. Consciousness is absolutely everywhere, and it's how you actually get to travel. But he said that, and then late in his life, he said something that I just started saying naturally to people when they were asking me in my early days. They were like, well, do you believe in God? And I'm like, well, I don't need belief anymore. I don't need faith. I have knowledge. I know God exists because I met him, right? I met that beyond intelligence, and we call it God, right? We use that word God, but there is an intelligence, right? And if you think about, this is really how our body works, because there's intelligence and consciousness within the cells. And if you don't think there's not, there's a video of some white blood cells chasing down a pathogen bacteria. Tell me that's not intelligent. Once you watch that, there's no way you're going to be able to say it's not intelligent. The consciousness and the intelligence of our body builds up into groups and multiple levels, and then those groups get together, and these multiple levels of intelligence and consciousness kind of pile up, and then eventually create our awaking consciousness in our head, right? And so science is coming to this, and all the bleeding edge scientists are coming to this conclusion that this is the way it works. And even split brain experiments where you cut the corpus callosum, which is the connecting rod between the left and right hemispheres of the brain, and then you start interviewing these people who have this two separate brains, and you can take out half your brain and still survive. But they have these two separate brains at that point that, each, like the amygdala, each has a node. So it's not like, you lose anything by losing a whole half of your brain, because there's two of everything up there. So, but you cut the corpus callosum in the middle, and you start asking questions of people who have had this surgery. And you say, what do you want to be when you grow up? Or what do you want to be as a profession? And the logic center, the language center of the brain will verbally say, I want to be a doctor. When the other side of your brain, which, by the way, controls your other side hand, that hand will be at the same time writing out race car driver with a pencil, because it doesn't have access to the speech section of the brain, but it wants to answer. So you ask, hey, what do you want to be as a profession? One side of the brain will say one thing, the other side of the brain will say another thing, and communicate simultaneously. And there's all sorts of really cool experiments that show multiple levels of consciousness in the brain, that you block one eye, and so only one side of the brain can see from whatever it is that you're putting in front of this person, right? And so the other side is blind, and you can measure the frustration. You can ask them a question about what they saw, and this side of the brain knows, and this side of the brain freaks out. It's like, what the hell are you talking about? And you can see it in fMRI, and you can see it with other results of other types of studies. And so it's really interesting that we have these multiple levels of consciousness that roll up into our waking consciousness and help create our existence here. But then to say, oh, that stops here. That right here, that's where that stops. I am the ultimate be-all, end-all, and my consciousness doesn't roll up into something else. Who knew? Can't have that, right? And what is that? That's just an ego statement, right? And so it's really interesting, going back to Lao Tzu's awesome statement of truth and wisdom, that this disease that we have, that we give each other constantly, that we pass down through genetics with the way the brain works, and it must have a self, and so it creates this false self of existence, which does serve the purpose. I mean, negative emotions and stuff do have a survival mechanism value to us, but at the same time, to live a completely wonderful life, an awesome life, a fully realized life, you got to get past that, right? Even Albert Einstein, a famous agnostic, said the true measure of a man is in the amount that he can be liberated from the self, or is measured in the amount that he liberates himself from the self, or something like that. I can't remember the exact statement, but basically this amazingly intelligent man who was not religious stated, the secrets of self are what it's all about, right? So it's really interesting. And it's really cool to just know that 2,600 years ago, Lao Tzu ran into the same exact stuff that we're running into today. That he made that same discovery, and that it's a physiological phenomena, and that it's just within us, and that all we have to do is press the right buttons and pull on the right knobs and get the right conditions and the right diet and the right, level of exercise or whatever it is, the chemicals, getting it all in line, getting it all set up to access what is just beyond this default mode network noise. That's just awesome. That's just awesome for me. So I wanted to share all that with you. I'm sorry for the ramble, but I think there's a lot of interesting stuff in there that we just need to keep discovering and exploring, because the answers to world peace are right here, because they start with inner peace. And at the point that you can get past this whole egoic and defensive self thing, and defense of the false self, and the ideas of nationality and race and politics and world religion and that type of thing, when we stop killing each other over those things, that's huge. That's huge. And you lack the motivation to kill people over these types of things when you start to realize, oh fuck, this thing's an illusion. And you get to discover that when it's replaced by this new sense of self that you get because you were able to shut this down for a little while, and then all of a sudden you were able to tap into everything else that exists just beyond. It's a physiological. Make no mistake. People who say, oh, science is stupid and the enemy and yada, the bullshit. Bullshit. Science is going to explain the phenomena that we call God. And is it going to make it any less holy? No, absolutely not. Who the fuck do you think invented science? You're killing me. You're killing me. You're killing me, Smalls. Love you guys. Hope you guys are having a great week. Talk to you soon. Peace.